Margaret Evans clutched her purse tightly as she stepped into the grand lobby of the city's most well-known bank. The high ceilings, marble floors, and crisp air conditioning made the place feel more like a courthouse than a place where people stored their hard-earned money. At 78 years old, Margaret wasn't as steady on her feet as she used to be, but she walked with quiet determination toward the teller's window. She had been a customer at this bank for over 40 years. She and her late husband, Robert, had opened their first account here when they bought their first home. Over the years, they had deposited every paycheck, every savings bond, every little bit they could to ensure their future was secure. Now, with Robert gone and her bills piling up, Margaret needed access to her funds. She reached the counter and smiled warmly at the young teller behind the glass. "Good afternoon, dear," she said, her voice trembling slightly with age. "I need to withdraw some money from my account." The teller barely looked up. "Do you have your ID, ma'am?" Margaret nodded and reached into her purse with slightly shaky hands. She pulled out her old leather wallet and carefully retrieved her driver's license. The teller took it, glancing at it for only a second before frowning. "This ID is expired." Margaret blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, I hadn't realized. I don't drive anymore, so I never thought to renew it. But I have my bank statements and my checkbook. I've been banking here for decades." The teller's expression remained blank. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't process withdrawals without valid identification." Margaret's heart sank. "But this is my money. I just need a small withdrawal to pay my bills. Surely, there's something you can do." The teller sighed and called over a manager, a tall man in an expensive suit with a cold expression. Margaret explained her situation again, hopeful that he would understand. "Mrs. Evans," he said, his voice clipped. "It's policy. Without a valid government-issued ID, we cannot release funds. There's nothing we can do." Margaret felt her throat tighten. "But I have my account number, my checks." The manager shook his head. "Policy is policy. You'll need to get a new ID and come back." Margaret stood there, feeling utterly helpless. A lifetime of responsible banking, years of loyalty, and she was being turned away like a stranger. She thought of the bills waiting at home, the food she needed to buy. She had no family left to help her. Her lip trembled, but she held her head high, trying to keep her dignity intact as she turned to leave. A voice from behind. Just as she took a step toward the door, a deep, steady voice called out, "Excuse me, what seems to be the issue here?" Margaret turned to see a man standing nearby, a tall figure with graying hair and a warm yet firm expression. He was dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, and there was something instantly recognizable about him. The bank manager's face paled. "Mr. Harrison, I didn't realize you were here." The man, Jonathan Harrison, a well-known philanthropist and businessman, stepped forward. He had overheard everything. His sharp eyes moved between Margaret and the bank staff, and something in his gaze made the manager shift uncomfortably. "She's a long-time customer, yet you're refusing to let her access her own money over a technicality?" Harrison's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind it. The manager straightened his tie. "It's just standard policy." Jonathan scoffed. "Standard policy should never override basic human decency." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Evans, may I?" Margaret, still stunned, nodded. Jonathan pulled out his own checkbook and began writing. He tore out a check and handed it to her. "This should cover your immediate needs." Margaret gasped. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly accept." "It's not charity," Jonathan assured her. "It's simply a helping hand. Just as I would hope someone would do for me if I were in your position." The bank manager's jaw tightened. "Mr. Harrison, this is highly irregular." Jonathan turned sharply to face him. "And what's truly irregular is that an institution trusted by the community would turn away an elderly woman in need rather than find a solution." His tone was steely. "Tell me, do you still want my business here?" The manager swallowed hard. Jonathan Harrison was one of the bank's most influential clients. Losing him would be a PR nightmare. The manager hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Perhaps we can make an exception in this case." Jonathan nodded. "That's more like it." Margaret clutched the check in her hands, tears forming in her eyes, not just because of the financial help, but because someone had finally seen her. The teller, now flustered, quickly processed Margaret's withdrawal. As she left the bank, she turned to Jonathan. "I don't know how to thank you." Jonathan smiled. "Just promise me one thing. Whenever you see someone struggling, do what you can. Kindness spreads further than you think." Margaret nodded, her heart full. That evening, she bought her groceries without fear of her card being declined. She paid her overdue bills, knowing she wouldn't have to go without electricity. And as she sat in her modest but warm home, she thought about Jonathan's words. A week later, Margaret found herself in a different situation. She was walking home from the market when she saw a young mother sitting on a bench, tears streaming down her face as she tried to console her small child. Margaret hesitated only for a moment before stepping forward. "Are you all right, dear?" The woman wiped her eyes. I just lost my job. I don't have enough for rent this month, and I don't know what to do." Margaret reached into her purse. She didn't have much, but she pulled out a few bills and placed them in the woman's hands. "Take this, and when you're back on your feet, just remember to do the same for someone else." The woman stared at her, eyes wide with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you." Margaret smiled. "Just pass it on." That night, as she settled into bed, she realized how different things could have been. If Jonathan hadn't stepped in that day, she might have spent weeks without heat, struggling to buy food. But instead, she was not only okay, she was now in a position to help someone else. One small act of kindness had changed everything. And in that moment, Margaret realized that no matter how small the act, kindness was never wasted.